The member for Watson.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. I loved Bob. I loved him as an Australian, I loved him as a Labor leader, and I loved him because over the last 10 years we became friends. We became quite close. As an Australian, we've already heard from people the way Bob Hawke knew us and was of us and loved us. But it was also, and what no speech can do, is bring together the way Bob Hawke would fill a room. Bob Hawke was not a tall man, and every time the political barb was thrown at John Howard as the term Little Johnny Howard, John Howard would protest that he was actually taller than Bob Hawke. But there was something in a small person's body that created this human giant the moment he walked into a room or the moment he spoke. I remember as a young delegate, a member of Young Labor, as a delegate at the Town Hall New South Wales conference, when Bob Hawke would come in to address us. And the beginning of the speech was always dreadful. Bob was not good at reading a fully written out speech. And at some point, about 10 minutes in, he'd get bored with what had been written and he would just take off. And there are a number of people who can walk into a small meeting room and fill it, but not many people can fill the town hall. But that was the measure of Bob. But he also loved the things that we loved. And one of the only moments of tension between me and Bob was one time when he offered me one of his Bob Hawke beers. Now, of course, as is common, or not as common for people of Irish heritage, I'm celiac. And so there's only a couple of brands of beer that I can have that don't wreck me. And when I said no, there was a movement in Bob Hawke's eyebrows. And they sharpened, and I started to try to explain. And as the eyebrows got sharper and sharper, I had that moment that for the first time I saw Bob as he looked when Andrew Peacock and John Howard looked at him. There was that just complete, I do not understand what you were saying to me. And from that moment on, every time I caught up with Bob, I made sure I had some gluten-free beer that I had brought with me so that the challenge wasn't quite the same. We've talked a lot about Bob's Prime Ministership, but it's important as Australians that we realise the way he represented us on the world stage, and even after he stopped being in this room, kept representing us on the world stage. The Borrow Forum on Asia is what China has always wanted to be, the Davos of Asia, the large international conference. Bob was asked to be the chair of that himself, and he had the view, no, if it was you needed to have an Asian leader as well, and the job was shared with Fidel Ramos. But Bob would go every year to Borrow, as senior ministers on each side of this House have over the years. And when he was there, there would be one night when all the Australians were called to the stage. And Australians from all different businesses, everyone from a foreign minister, from Liberal or Labor, through to Twiggy Forrest or whoever else would be there, would be called up onto the stage, and you would be obliged to sing Waltzing Matilda with Bob. But there was a rule. He would hand the microphone to everyone when it came to the chorus, but the moment it got to the verses, he would seize it back, because only Bob was allowed to sing the verses. And if anyone, even though they didn't have the microphone, tried to join in, they'd get a sharp look and they'd be told that was for him. And that Waltzing Matilda event would be heard throughout events throughout Australia and the world. I think one of the testaments to Bob's legacy is the fact that today we want to pretend so much of it was bipartisan. And that's a good thing. That's good that we want to remember the world as it is now. But Bob was always amused about the number of fights he had to have for things that are now considered bipartisan. And he was okay with it. If people want to own the legacy, go for it. But the truth is he always had a view that if you were going to deregulate the economy, you had to increase the security in people's lives. And that was why Medicare was fought for, and that wasn't bipartisan. And that was why superannuation was fought for, which still isn't bipartisan. And that was why one of the great achievements, and I think one of the great honours for all of the members of Parliament in this House, a great honour that will always rest with Bill Shorten, is the fact that a resolution on race that Bill Shorten had the privilege to move last year, that was carried without dissent in this parliament, was with only one word change exactly what had been moved by Bob Hawke years earlier, with John Howard as leader of the opposition insisting that it be opposed and divided on, and people like Philip Ruddock crossing the floor. And so I don't draw that as to draw back the pain of the past, but simply to say, let's not pretend this was easy for Bob at the time, that there was sudden bipartisanship. Where Australia has got to now is so much of what Bob was fighting for then. And as an Australian, Bob understood so well the concept of mateship. And in conversations with him late last year, when he was tired and he was frail, there was one moment in particular where he particularly lit up, and he said, "You know, Paul and I are mates again. We've sorted it out, we've fixed it." And he beamed. It meant so much to him that the years of tension and difference with Paul Keating had gone full circle and the friendship was there again. I love Bob because I'm Labor. And for me, I joined the Labor Party because of the saving of the Daintree rainforest. It was a campaign for the Daintree that caused me to become a member of the Labor Party in the first place. And we rattle off very quickly the Franklin, the Daintree, Kakadu and Antarctica. When Bob and I started to become friends were the years when I held the environment portfolio. We need to remember with Antarctica, it wasn't just a simple decision. It had got to the cabinet papers, and as Bob was reading his cabinet papers on the weekend, it was already there as a recommendation that Australia would agree to mining in Antarctica. And Bob read it, and Bob responded with a term that is certainly not parliamentary, and took it to Cabinet, and the advice from everyone around Cabinet and all the smart people was, it's too late, it's done. Every other country signed on. And Bob said, no, we're not doing this, and got onto his friend, Jacques Cousteau, and both Paul and Bob were involved in conversations with Michel Rocard, then the Prime Minister of France. And they turned it all around. And it was a great privilege for the 20th anniversary of that treaty to be in Hobart with Bob Hawke and Michel Rocard, celebrating the 20th anniversary of what was and what will always be the largest conservation decision in the history of our planet. There never has been before and won't be again an occasion when a conservation decision of that size is made on this planet. And that belongs to two men who have both now passed away in Bob Hawke and Michel Rocard. Bob had never been to any of our bases in Antarctica, even though he was responsible for it. And so as Environment Minister, I managed to get him onto one of the planes and was so happy and surprised, because I'd never seen the photos, but at his memorial service at the Opera House, one of the photos that came up was of Bob in Antarctica. I was worried at the time as to whether or not we might get in trouble for having sent him there and whether it might become a partisan thing, which it never did, but just to make sure, I made sure that the Shadow Minister for the Environment, the member for Flinders, was also invited on a trip to the Antarctica, which he didn't take up, but I never let him know why until now. But that was back when we got Bob there. Warren Snowden referred to the Kakadu decision. And one of the arguments that Bob used, and it was public at the time, against his own cabinet decisions, when the traditional beliefs of the Jawoyn people were being mocked, he said, how can you expect respect for your Christian faith and not respect the faith of the people that have always been on this land on this particular issue? How can you do that? And Bob would often talk about his cabinet. He loved his cabinet. There were many times he'd say to me, "You've got a good cabinet," or when we were in government, and he was very complimentary of the front bench that we took to the last election. But he would always pause after that and say, "But not as good as my cabinet." But notwithstanding how much he loved his cabinet, even though a majority said to go the other way, he put his authority on the line, and his view is that that was the final straw in losing the Prime Ministership. But when Stage 3 of Kakadu was added to the World Heritage Area, there was a gap within the boundary, an area called Koongarra. The reason there was a gap in Koongarra was the traditional owners, the Jock clan at that point, were divided as to whether they wanted it permanently protected or whether they might want it mined at some point in time. And 20 years later, the Jock clan was down to one member. There is today only one surviving member of the Jock clan, Geoffrey Lee. And for all the different moments I've had in this chamber, the most special one for me, I suspect, will always be when we put through the legislation to add Koongarra to the World Heritage Area and add it to the National Park. Harry was in the chair. I was the minister moving the motion. Shadow Minister was in here for it. And sitting side by side on those public gallery chairs just over there was Bob Hawke sitting beside Geoffrey Lee to watch the next stage of the Kakadu legacy take place. And when we had a media conference later that day, which never made it into the evening news, but that's life, Bob took no credit on himself. His entire speech to the gallery was about Geoffrey Lee, a man who could have become a multi-millionaire and yet had decided to preserve his land forever by adding it to the World Heritage Area. And finally, I referred at the start, Bob and I became friends and quite close. I've never known anybody so ready to die. Not wishing it on, but believing, yep, it was imminent. And at the Woodford Folk Festival over summer, he said to me many times, he said, you know, mate, I won't be back. This is my last one. And he was relaxed about it. And for a lot of us who were friends of his, we found this really challenging because we weren't quite as relaxed about it as he was. But he was convinced, and right, that he wouldn't be coming back. And so he'd sit doing his cryptic crosswords each day because he was determined to always keep his mind sharp. And so he'd do his cryptic crossword each time, and as Linda Burney mentioned, the room where it was done at the Woodford Folk Festival, as only the Woodford Folk Festival can do, call their head office the Kremlin. And so sitting at the Kremlin each day, Bob would be there doing his cryptic crossword, and there was a view that he was probably too frail to go out to the festival this time. So instead of leading the festival in Waltzing Matilda, they recorded some and played it on the big screen, and the crowd went wild. And while he would sing Waltzing Matilda for the crowd outside, within the Kremlin, it was always solidarity forever. But the rule was the same. Don't try to join in the verses. Our role was to help with the chorus with fists raised, and he would take the verses for himself. They then decided towards the end of the festival, Bob turned to his great friend Bill Horrocks, who together with Amanda Jacques run the festival. And they went out on the buggy and for Bob to have a look at the festival. And they went from the private area out to the public area, and no one looked. And they drove the full length of the first street, and no one had noticed. And Bob was quite crestfallen, and he turned to Bill and he said, "They've forgotten." And Bill thought, well, we'll turn the corner and we'll go back. And as they turned the corner, one person at quite a distance, pointed, and at the top of his voice said, "There's Hawke!" And from that moment, he was mobbed. Nothing had changed. The love that you would have seen 20, 30 years earlier was there at the festival, with people taking selfies, people wanting to talk to him, people just wanting to say thank you, Bob. And after about 40 minutes, he said to Bill, "Please take me back." He'd had enough. But that moment where he thought maybe the relationship with Australia had changed showed that it hadn't, and even with his passing, it never will. I'm grateful for his friendship and grateful through those festivals that I got to know Blanche, I got to know Louis and Brie. I didn't get to know Hazel at any point in her life, nor do I know very well Sue, Steve and Rosalind, but obviously to everybody, my condolences. I'll miss a great Australian, I'll miss a Labor leader, and I'll miss my friend.